Ron Gingrich, pastor, former college and seminary professor, leading us in thinking about blessings. Ron, welcome back.
Thank you, Dale. And it really is good to be back. And I love talking and teaching. But being a teacher is always risky business because I can end up being under the same indictment that Jesus gives to teachers, especially the teachers of the Pharisees. He tells his disciples, listen to what they say, but what? But do better than they do at doing what they teach. And so it's sort of like, you know, if you listen to what I say and don't do anything about it, I haven't really been a very good teacher. Well, no, I shouldn't say that. Maybe I've been a good teacher, but you haven't been a very good student. So today I want to begin, again, I'm referring back to this philosopher and who's done a lot with language, J.L. Austin. How to do things with words. And I want us to think about doing things with words, not beginning down on the ground, looking at the tree in the forest, which I call the tree of blessing, but going about 30,000 feet up and looking down at the forest and noticing there are many other trees in that forest other than the tree of blessing. There are many other trees that are words that do things. What are some of the other trees that do things in our lives? We do things by blessing people. We do things by warning people. That's another tree. Isn't that an important tree? We do things by blaming people. Well, that may be a tree that it's not very good to keep eating from. But we need to look and notice what all of these trees are. And there are words that go along with each of these trees. But there are often rituals and actions that go along with these trees. I assume, well, I don't just assume, I am sure that many of you know Scripture well enough that when I say the Scripture today begins, in the beginning, what comes next? Oh, I think I heard two things. In the beginning, the Word was with God, and the Word was God. What is the other thing I heard? In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. And I think those two things I think John is very intentional when he sort of sucks us in and begins his gospel the same way Genesis begins. In the beginning, and what is the next thing we have? In the beginning was and if you know any Greek, what is the word for word? Logos. In the beginning was the word, and that can mean a single word that I'm speaking. It can be a word printed on a page. Is that what John means? In the beginning was a word printed on the page, and the word was. It doesn't say the word was, well, it does say the word was God eventually, doesn't it? The word was with God, and the word was God. We know, I love languages. Partly that's why I like talking. But I love languages because talking and words shape my life. And whether you admit it or not, whether you claim it or not, words have shaped your life all the way through. I said, how do you do things with words? And one of the things that we do with words, one of the trees in that forest is with words we remember. But that's sort of a loaded word too, isn't it? Remembering. As a student in high school and college and seminary and grad school, I was really pretty good at remembering. What did that mean? Oh, when it came on the test, right when you asked me the question, I could recall what the answer was supposed to be and put it down. And generally, that was quite satisfactory with the teacher, with the professor. So when Jesus says, do this to remember me, is he talking about giving me a quiz? What does he mean by remember? What does that word remember mean to him? Is it about my academic, my intellectual ability to tell you what the gospel says? So when we remember Jesus, and he says, I want to do, what is the this that he's talking about? Do we ever have a time, a place where we do this to remember Jesus? What do we call that? That's interesting. We call it communion. And communion, it has to do with union, right? Becoming unified with communion. So at least we're in the right area. We're seated around the right tree. Communion, remembering. Catholics don't call it communion. What do they call it? Eucharist. We don't use that much here in Mennonite congregations, do we? Next Sunday, we are going to celebrate Eucharist here at College Mennonite Church. And that would be a bit jarring for all of us, wouldn't it? What does that word Eucharist mean? Language is so fun and so good and so informative. When we have that EU beginning of the word, Eucharist, eulogy, euphony, what does that you mean? Good. Good. So a eulogy is what? Oh, there we get that word related to logos. Eulogos. The eulogy is a good word. Euphony. What is euphony? Oh, it's good music. It's harmonious music. So, Eucharist. What is chorus? Have you ever heard a girl's name Carissa? That's related to chorus. Or have you ever heard of charisma? What is Eucharist? Good grace. And it's really related to one part of that ritual that we call communion or Eucharist. There are 4 actions there. There are, around that tree of Eucharist, there are really trees with 4 branches. And you need all of the branches there. The branches have to do with the actions that accompany the words. And what are the actions? And Jesus took the bread and he blessed it. He gave that Eucharist. He gave thanks, he blessed it, and he broke it, and he gave it. And all of those are a part of that word that goes along with this remembrance. Do this to remember me. Think of the road to Emmaus. And they're at the table. Do you remember the two people who were walking with Jesus? And they got talking and they were intrigued with the responses and his questions. And they sat at the table and eating. And what happened? Jesus took the bread, blessed it, broke it, and gave it. And what happened? In the cartoons, there's a light bulb above their heads. Then they remembered, they knew from this word, this ritual, and they remembered all that Jesus had talked about. And had he ever done this ritual before? Obviously he had, because that triggered, when had Jesus previously taken, blessed, broken, and gave? We have several places in the Gospels where he did that. Where is one of those places?
Feeding the multitudes.
Feeding the multitudes. Each time there is feeding the multitudes, Jesus took the bread, blessed it, broke it, and gave it. That just was along with what he was doing. And think of the blessing. There was another time in the upper room. He does the same thing. So is this just a ritual we do? Sort of, because Jesus says, you know the routine, go through with it. The word is much bigger than that. I mean, in the New Testament, in the book of Acts, what do they call Eucharist or communion? They don't call it either Eucharist or communion. The breaking of the bread. And I think they broke bread together daily. And we think, oh, they had, was it potluck, or did somebody just cook the meal? They broke bread together. I think it's much more, they took the bread, blessed it, broke it, and gave it. They had this way of remembering Jesus daily. So Jesus was doing things with words. And in our English language, do this, when we translate it, do this to remember me. And as I ask the question, what does remembering mean? It's not just a cognitive activity. We could learn a lot from our Jewish brothers and sisters, because at every Passover, they have a celebration of remembering. What are they remembering? What? The Exodus, coming out of Egypt. And, but what do they say about coming out of Egypt at that meal? We remember that they were slaves in Egypt and God brought them out of Egypt. Is that what they say? No. I had it almost right, except I had the pronoun wrong. We remember what? That we were slaves in Egypt and God brought us out from there. Is that truthful or is that a lie? Were they actually slaves in Egypt? No. Or were they? They were remembering. What is remembering about? Become like a little child. Jesus told us that, didn't he? Little children are good at imagining and going back. They're good at, we say playing, but we think playing is trivial, but playing is serious. And unless I remember that I was a slave in Egypt, I don't know what it feels like to be a slave, to be under hard bondage. Do you? And I think all of us need to use that Jewish practice of remembering. We really ought to write the word re-member. What does it mean to member again? Do you have any members, any body parts that you call body members. If we remember, we participate and go back and enter in that and become an active participant in that drama. At the Seder service, at the Passover service, Jews do that every year. And Jews have a part of the service is to say, there are 4 ways that you can respond to this. There are 4 ways that you can respond to remembering. And they talk about the 4 children. One child says, what do you mean I was a slave in Egypt? They're smart enough to know they were there. Another one, the youngest one is too naive and says, I don't know what you're talking about. Just tell me the story and I will enter the story. Remembering. You notice how remembering there is not just a cognitive activity. It's a dramatic activity where Jesus says, come on, folks, enter the drama, be along with me, enter my play that takes, blesses, and breaks and shares. And do we see Jesus doing that in his life? Oh, we see it again and again, don't we? What happens with the feeding of the 5,000, the 4,000? What happens? Jesus accepts whatever we bring. And he doesn't look at it and say, oh, that's sort of a scrawny bit of a lunch. That's just a little bread and a little fish. So that really won't work. He says, thank you. This is a blessed gift that you have given me. And what's the next thing? I'm going to break it and give it to everyone else. And what happens? It goes back to another story about manna. There is bread enough for everyone in God's kingdom. So, these trees that do things, I didn't grow up thinking, I sort of intuitively knew that words did things. I thought that words just said things. In the Bible, in the book of Leviticus, in the book of Numbers, it talks about, in our English Bible, it talks about this part of the Bible. We say, you shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself any graven images. What do we call that? That begins what? Command. How many? 10. It says in those books, in our English Bibles, it says, and God gave them the 10 commandments. That's really not what it says in Hebrew. In the Septuagint, it says, and God gave them the 10 logoi. What is that? Logos. God gave them the 10 words. And in Hebrew, it's clearly devarim. God gave them the 10 words. Is a word the same as commandment? Well, a word, a commandment is one of the trees in the forest of the word. But we as Christians, Catholics, Protestants, begin the 10 words at the wrong place. Why? Because we've chosen to emphasize the commandment part. What's the first word that the Jews have in the 10 words? It doesn't begin, you shall have no other gods before me. It begins, I am Yahweh your God who brought you up out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. It's a word, isn't it? Is it a commandment? No, it's not a commandment, so we can't begin there. Oh, except we should. because this word is a much bigger word. It's a word about covenant. And covenant is one of those things in the Old Testament. There are two types of covenants that reflect on the trees and the woods. There is the covenant of divine commitment. That is God's unequivocal commitment to humans. The commitment to Abraham, to Isaac, and Jacob. You know, if you look in Genesis 9, we have that commitment. And let me just read that. And there is no requirement of humans in this passage. God blessed, you wondered if I was ever going to get back to blessing, right? But God blessed, I'm sorry, not Genesis 9, Genesis 12. But in Genesis 9, the first words are God blessed Noah. But in Genesis 12, it says, now God, the Lord, said to Abraham, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and will curse, and who curses you, I will curse. And by you, all of the families of the earth shall be blessed. All the families of the earth shall bless themselves. In this word of blessing, is there any requirement on humans? Not really, is there? God,
you say so that you will be a blessing.
In many ways, it is so that you will be a blessing, but it doesn't say go be a blessing. It just says, you accept my blessing, and if you know what's going on, you will not be a hoarder. You will not be a capitalist and try to collect as much as you can and put it on a pile. You will spread the blessing because you notice that's what I've done. But you notice there is a word of divine commitment. So that's one type of covenant in the Old Testament. And I would say it's a covenant of undeserved blessing. What did Abraham do to deserve that blessing? He didn't do a thing, did he?
Got up and left home.
He got up and left home, but did that earn him the blessing? He wouldn't have got it if it wouldn't have been the case. But and at this point in time, he hadn't even left home. Because God said, listen, it's an imperative, not a narrative form of the verb. You go from your country and your house and your kindred to the land I will show you. You go, and I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you. There is sort of a requirement of leaving. But he doesn't say, Abram, because you're such a good person, if you go, I will bless you. He just says, get going, and I promise I will bless you. This same covenant of divine commitment, a type of blessing, is there with David. When God chooses David, is David this highly deserving person? When God chooses people, does God always choose the most gifted, the most pure, the most faultless people to work with? I hope you could all say very strongly, no. And I'm really glad, or I probably wouldn't be in it. Who does God choose? Who does God choose to bless? That's one of those strange things. God chooses to bless whoever God chooses to bless. But God chooses to bless in order that the blessing be really passed around. So that by the blessing you have received, all people will bless themselves. When we come to the 10 words, we get another type of covenant. We're in another part of the woods with another whole bunch of trees. This blessing to Abraham is a word of, I said, divine commitment. It's a word of promise, but promise can have to do with way out there. But commitment is a relationship between us. What can you do to make God love you more than God does right now? You really can't do anything. We say that, but then we fall back on, well, if I'm a good person, God will love me more. And it's sort of like, well, I think God's love is not based on deserving. God's statement about love, using that word love. I love the book of Jonah. Why did Jonah not go to Nineveh? Nineveh was the empire. Nineveh was the America or Russia of their world. They were the big power. They carried the big stick. And did Jonah not know to go to Nineveh because he was scared of the Ninevites? Jonah said, God told Jonah, go to Nineveh and tell them 40 days and they'll be destroyed. Why didn't Jonah go to Nineveh? Do you know what he says later on in the book? I didn't go to Nineveh because, God, I knew who you were. You were a God of mercy and kindness and greatness. And if I said, you Ninevites, and I think Jonah would have loved this message. You Ninevites, 40 days and you're going down the flusher. You're done. That's about what every Israelite would have liked. The big empire would be gone. But Jonah said, I knew if I went and I preached that message, and if these cruel animals, this cruel empire would take my message seriously, what would you do, God? You're a God of mercy. You're longstanding. You would forgive them. You'd let them off the hook. And that put Jonah in a double bind. What was Jonah's message? What was Jonah's word? It was a simple word. 40 days and you'll be destroyed. Period. No ifs, ands, or buts. And what happened? Did Jonah's message come true? Oh. And since it didn't come true, what did that word that God told Jonah to proclaim, what did that word make Jonah? He was a prophet saying 40 days and you'll be destroyed. And they weren't destroyed. So what did that make him? If you know the book of Deuteronomy, how do you judge what a prophet is? Well, they need to proclaim in the name of the Lord. And Jonah was doing that. But what's the other test of whether a prophet is a true prophet or not? Do their words come true? Jonah's message to the Ninevites was opposite of the word of blessing. It was not a curse, but it was a punishment. It was the sentencing. And with a sentence like that, what always, in our courts, what precedes the sentence? The verdict, right? And so it was obvious with a sentence of 40 days and you'll be destroyed. What was the verdict about the moral fiber, about the actions of Nineveh? Guilty or not guilty? You don't declare somebody not guilty. And you don't, and then say 40 days and you'll be destroyed. So the word of Jonah, I think Jonah ran because he knew who God was, and he knew if he proclaimed that message, if God was the God that Jonah thought he was, Jonah would end up looking like a false prophet. Do we have false prophets in the Bible? Well, we have some that are obviously false prophets, but none that are included as a book with their name on it, except Jonah. And would you rather have Jonah be a true prophet or a false prophet? Well, in this case, he's a false prophet who is a true prophet. So how do you like that for a conundrum? The word that he declared didn't happen, but it didn't happen. And I think we're a lot like Jonah when we know somebody should be guilty. And God says, we let them off the hook, and we say, God, but God, they deserved it. Isn't that the way God's justice works? No. And Jonah knew that's not the way God's justice works, to give people what they deserve. Do you want God to give you what you deserve? You don't have to answer that, but I know how I answer that. No, I don't. Because I know that I have enough flaws, mistakes, stumbles, all of that I don't want God to give me what I deserve. But God's justice is different than that. God doesn't give you what you deserve. Aren't you happy about that? So what does God give you? What you need. And giving people what they deeply need is the definition of what God's justice is. And giving what they need is really what's going on with the blessing. Blessing is an unadulterated, undeserved gift that comes from the charis of God, the grace of God. It's a it's a Eucharistic gift. And not many of you look that happy today. That's better. That's the way there ought to be a smile when we know God gives us what we need. What's the amount of God giving us what we need? How much of what we need does God give us? To make us really rich, abundantly rich? To make us top dogs? Before Israel ever gets to Sinai, God gives them a blessing. But it's a blessing that's an economic lesson. God's economics 101 are taught in the wilderness before they get to Sinai. What's the word of God's blessing? God's economic blessing. Material, stuff blessing before they get to Sinai. And I think it's related to the feeding of the multitudes and to Eucharist. And manna is this strange. Manna is not a word that is, manna is a sentence in Hebrew. It's not a word, it's a sentence. Well, it is a word because sentences are words. You know, the way we're talking about words. And you know what manna means? What is it? Children got up in the morning, adults got up in the morning, and they saw this stuff on the ground, and they didn't say, oh, we recognize this. We looked it up in the dictionary and it says manna. They said, manna. What is it? It's sort of like, I think that's a pretty good definition of God's grace. God's blessing. It's surprising. What was the amount of the manna that was there in the wilderness? What was the amount of this blessing? How much did they collect?
Enough for one day.
Enough for one day. And if some people had a little more than enough and some people didn't have enough, what happened? They shared it. So there was enough for everyone for one day. But there is another economic lesson that goes on. There are certain times that what happens on the 6th day of the week? You gather enough for 2 days. And always, on the first, second, on the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th day, if they saved any overnight, what happened? It got full of, it rotted. It got full of maggots. Well, that is just enough to make me want to puke. And so, after 6 days, we've learned that don't keep this stuff overnight because it's going to be maggoty. God says, no, on the 6th day, collect enough for 2 days. And so, what do the good people do? Begin to listen to God and take God seriously. It's like, now, do I do what God said for the first 6 days? And obviously that's going to happen today. Or do I listen to a new word for God? So some of them collected enough for 2 days and some didn't. What happened to the ones who didn't? No manna on the 7th day. Well, going back to blessing. Blessing is sort of like our communion, Eucharist, breaking of the bread, whatever you want to call that drama. Blessing is a drama where Isaac is wanting to touch and feel his son Esau. And you know how Rebekah connives with Jacob to trick Esau into giving the blessing to Jacob instead of Esau. But because blessing is a hands-on experience. And if you are around the tree of blessing and want to practice it, it's not just saying when somebody sneezes, what do we say? Bless you. It's like, no. That is so far from the actual performative act of blessing. The performative act would be, I say to Alan, oh, you sneeze? May God richly bless you and protect you, and may God's face shine upon you. And something happens when there is sort of an energy that passes when we touch somebody else. When we say that, am I just saying to Alan, gee, I hope God takes care of you? Is that what we're saying? It's not just a hopeful thing. It's a sense of actively empowering. Can I actively empower God to act in your life? Yeah. You actually have that much power? Well, I think we do, but we often don't know how that we actually can do things with words. And when we put our hands on somebody, as a child that says, I don't want to go to school tomorrow. A couple of the other kids are such big bullies. Why don't we just say, put on your big boy pants and get to school? That's what we often say. But I think we ought to say, you are strong enough, and you will be able to figure out ways that God will help you respond to this bullying. And whether it's what you say or do that changes the bullying, or whether it's simply giving you the strength to get through the day and deal with it. It's not making a false promise. Why don't we say that to refugees from Ukraine right now? God bless you. We bless them, but we also say you are welcome, and you come among us, and you will sense God's blessing here and now. Now, going back, so when you look at which is Genesis 27, I have an assignment for you today. You can just not watch the Super Bowl. Reading Genesis 27 and Genesis 48, where the ritual action of Esau blessing Jacob, and in Genesis 48, Jacob blessing Joseph's two sons. Read those, and then mutter on it. I love that word. It's in English, we often say meditate on it. Happy are those who walk not in the counsel of the wicked, nor linger in way of sinners, nor sit in the seat of the scornful. But their delight is in the law of on the Torah, the teaching of the Lord, and they meditate, and they mutter on it day or night. Just mutter on it. What it would be to receive and practice blessing. That will give you a good assignment for next week. How do the people that you come into contact with, family members, neighbors, children, people even older than you, how do you bless them? And the word blessing actually means, how do you empower them with a word? Children, and we're all children, but children in adolescence and a little older than that are really longing for blessing, but aren't we all?
It seems that implied in blessing is believing in something or someone.
Right.
And that is communicated and by the receiver, and it's a very strong, a strong element.
Yes.
That provides encouragement. Yes.
Right. That's really important. It's when we give a blessing, we are actually saying we believe in someone. So, and there's another sort of word that gets mistranslated in our culture. What's a better word that we really believe someone has that power? The word believe from Hebrew actually means trust. No, they're the same. But I trust when I say, may Alan, may God heal your body. It's not just a wish. I trust that God has the ability to do that, and that God will. Does that mean ask and God has to do what I say? Isn't that what Jesus said? Ask and it will be given you. But he waits for us to construct that whole word. Ask, and then don't just ask is different than demand. Petition, and God will give it to you. Maybe not in the form you ask, but maybe in the form God chooses to give to you. And I think often, I've trusted, I believe that God will act. I've told God what to do, and then guess what I do? I wait to see if God does what I told God to do. That doesn't work sometimes, because what happens? God does something outside of the box that I told God to do. So has God answered my prayer or not? God has blessed me in a way that I didn't want or didn't expect. And so when I make a petition to God, there's a step in there that says, just wait, just wait. I know God is going to bless, but it may not be in the way I think God ought to be acting. So that is going to push me in new ways. This word of blessing is not just, we sneeze and we say, God bless you. Or it's the actual trust that I can communicate to you a word that you wait, but that you're also empowered. Now, I've spent too much time talking about this, from way up above looking at the forest. The forest is filled with trees of God's blessing. But they're complex trees. And so I've given you 2 chapters to read as you are either, if you're bored with the football during the Super Bowl, read it while they're playing football, or if you really like the football action, don't listen to the ads and read Genesis 27:48 and Genesis 1. Because all 3 of those are filled with the trees of blessing. And Genesis 1 is filled with trees of blessing. But when you understand what blessing is, God is blessing during the days of creation, even when the word blessing isn't used. On the first day, God creates light. Part of blessing is the one who creates gets to name, and naming is a blessing. He calls the light day, and the darkness he calls night. Second day, God divides the waters above from the waters beneath. It's not the way we think about our world. And God gives names. We're still naming things, aren't we? We have a whole new set of names that your grandparents never, ever knew anything about. A cell phone. What? For your grandmother or grandfather, what's a cell phone? What's a television? There are new things happening that we name, and the names are part of a system. But really, on the third day, after God creates the dry land and the seas, and then does God say, let there be plants on the earth? Does God speak a word to create plants? It's a little more subtle than that. What does God say on that third day? It's really Act 2, Day 3. Let the earth bring forth vegetation. What's happening there? Is God really creating? What's the earth's part in that? God blesses the earth with fertility. Day 6, time's up. Day 6, God said, or day 5, let the waters teem with swarming things. Let the waters bring forth. look at Genesis 1 and say, now, are you really created in the image of God, or has that been totally, sort of obliterated with sin? I think we're still in the image of God. And if we're in the image of God, we ought to be doing the thing that God's doing, right? God spends a lot of time blessing. God spends naming. God spends commissioning. We need to be doing that. 2 minutes yet. What questions do you have? Yes.
Don't we have the issue of evolution and science and a whole new set of information that somehow doesn't get recorded in the scriptures. And that just really presents a major problem for me. And we jump to God said it, and Jesus blessed it. And I just think there's so much more going on that I don't know how we get hold of that. The human creativity enters the picture.
And all I would say is, if you're a literalist all the way through, we have loads of problems. Creationists are literalists all the way through. And we sort of buy into their reading and say, well, when we read it like them, we got your problem. And it's like, but I don't think that's the way we're supposed to read Genesis. We're supposed to read Genesis, as at the end of the 6th day, God rested because he was done doing things, but we're created in God's image to do what? And have plants evolved since the 6th day of creation? Have animals? Well, if you don't believe in evolution, you shouldn't be eating sweet corn, Charlie's sweet corn. Because that sweet corn is totally different than the sweet corn 30 years ago. I mean, scientifically, we know that sugar content is much higher. Was that just an accident? It was human creativity. I mean, I think God created humans, and he said, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. That's what God had been doing for 6 days, being fruitful and multiply and filling the earth. And we've heard it hierarchically, and have dominion over it and subdue it. And dominion is really, and like in the 2nd chapter, you care for it. You help the earth be fruitful. You have, having sweeter sweet corn and bigger and sweeter tomatoes is not going against Genesis 1. But it's not, we need to read these imaginatively, but we need to take the story, the narrative, and all I would say is every narrative, this is not original with me, every narrative is a fiction. Every narrative creates a world that we dwell in. And it's either, does that reflect on the world that we know is around us? Or is it a false world? And I think the creationists have created a false world, both about what God created and created us to be, and who we are and what we're supposed to be and what is going on in this world. It doesn't say at the end of the 6th day, God said, and let nothing ever change from the way it was. Okay. Have a good day, and may you be more attuned to Genesis, to these 3 stories, than you're concerned about the Super Bowl. Because I think the Super Bowl is one of is sort of a golden calf of our idolatry.